no one wants to follow or be led by a coward. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Totally Unacceptable. I'm your host, Ed Clementi. And today, we are going to tackle a topic that seems to be growing as a major pain point for so many of you. Today, we are going to talk about micromanagement. This topic pops up everywhere. If you are on LinkedIn on any given day, you're going to see post after post on the topic of micromanagement. You will see lists of what it looks like. You will see articles on why it's bad, and you will see calls for folks to leave these kind of situations. But very rarely do you see anything that attempts to uncover the whys of micromanagement. Why does it manifest? Or even rarer is how we can attempt to solve for the situation. I think micromanagement is a complex topic. If there are leaders out there listening to this episode and you have led anyone, you have also very, very likely fallen into the micromanagement trap. I know I certainly have. What this show is about is highlighting the areas that we should see as unacceptable, but also trying to understand them so we can move forward in a positive way. We can try to course correct. So why does micromanagement happen? And I mean the real root causes. Once we know the root causes, we get to acknowledge it, own it, and then try to solve for it. But there's one thing we can agree. Micromanagement kills morale. It kills trust. It kills teams. It kills productivity. Every single day in workplaces everywhere. There's a quote that I like by Lao Tzu. A leader is best when people barely know he or she exists. So when the work is done, the people will say, we did it ourselves. Now, isn't that what leadership is all about? It's about coaching, guiding. It's about giving opportunity, letting people shine, helping them grow. So you're helping to create the leaders of the future. Micromanagement does none of that. And I know if you're a person who's newly charged with leading people, micromanagement might feel like you have control. It might feel like you're acting as you should. But I would ask you to pause and really reflect. What are you actually in control of? And how's it working out for you? Are your people happy? Is morale high? Do they feel like they're trusted? Are they growing? Are they producing? Are they staying? If you are really micromanaging, I would argue the answer to those things is no. And if that's the case, well, the good news is you get to solve for it. If you are a leader that cares to do this for the long term, because it takes time to build trust. It takes time to build teams that believe in you. It takes time to help them grow and create loyalty. It takes time. Those efforts will pay off in the long term. You'll end up having high producing teams with high morale, with high loyalty. And people will look at you and go, how do you do it? How is your team so damn productive? And the secret will be you decided to lead for the long game. You decided to operate with care. You decided to invest in yourself as a leader and in your team. The truth of the matter is, leaders who micromanage don't trust themselves enough to trust their teams. You see, I feel very strongly that micromanagement is rooted in insecurity. But for the purpose of this episode, I don't think that that's good enough. I think we have to open up the hood even more. What is that insecurity rooted on? So when thinking about this, I really believe that insecurity is rooted on fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of losing relevance. I want you all to listen very carefully to this episode, especially if you find yourself as a leader micromanaging or as someone who's getting micromanaged, so that together we can develop a good understanding based on different perspectives. Because not all leaders who act in this way are doing so with poor intent. Let's face it, leadership is hard. The pressures of accountability are real. And these people also have families to feed. So let's try to understand the why in the hopes that these answers will provide insights into how we can turn these things around. So let's get into it. One of the more common fears that I think exists is fear of losing control. A lot of times someone gets promoted after having great success as themselves, meaning they were a one-man or one-woman show. They had great productivity, they executed, they were reliable, they get promoted, and bam, now they have other people to manage. But what they're used to is controlling everything. They control when they get in the morning. They control when they leave. They control how hard they work. They control how much they invest in themselves to get better. And they're not reliant on anyone else but themselves for their success. But when they now are responsible for a team and their success is also reliant on their team, there's a natural tendency to want to try and control all those outcomes. And why? Well, you might be a perfectionist and you don't like how someone on your team isn't a perfectionist. And so you want to get into the details and tell them, do this, change this word. The paragraphs are too long. I don't like the visuals. It could also be because there's a ton of pressure from above, and maybe you've actually even been told you are responsible not just for yourself, but for your team. So make sure your team is on it. Maybe you've actually had some previous experience managing and you got burned. Maybe you inherited a team and you're not bought in on their skill sets and abilities. Or maybe you believe control is the same as leading, but it is not. So you can quickly see all the things that can manifest just from that one fear. That's why I wanted to spend time to really get into this, because it's deep. And if you're a person who is being micromanaged, I want you to take this perspective, because one day you might be in that situation. Imagine going from just you to leading, and you have some confidence issues because it's new, which is totally understandable. And you happen to be a perfectionist, or maybe you've been burned by a team before, or maybe the pressures are really high. Maybe you're not sold on all your team's abilities, which, by the way, if you're a leader, you got to help them get there. You can quickly see how that fear can result in micromanagement. So we can actually now go even deeper. Fear of losing control is rooted on fear of failing, because stakes are high. Especially, you all know, as you move up in the ranks, the target gets bigger. Why does the target get bigger, you might say? Well, because now you have a big title, you have more exposure, your compensation is likely higher, so the expectations are higher. Personally, the stakes are high for you and your career. You don't want to let your boss down. You don't want to let your organization down. You don't want to let yourself down. You don't want to let your family down. You don't want to let your team down. That fear of failure causes you to want to control more. Maybe you're in an organization where mistakes are heavily scrutinized or punished. Then you have leaders who become extremely risk averse. They can't afford to have a mistake. So to avoid any of that, they micromanage. And then there's the fear of being exposed as a fraud. A lot of times we refer to this as imposter syndrome. You begin to think to yourself, do I truly deserve this role? Should I have all this responsibility? Am I even fit to be a leader? All these things of self-doubt come in, especially newly promoted when you're sitting around a table with people who have been there for years and years. There's a lack of confidence, whether it's relative to your role or whether it's relative to your ability to lead. If you lack confidence in your ability to perform in a given role, or you lack confidence in your ability to lead people, or both, there's a tendency to try to be involved in everything to make sure nothing goes wrong. There's a tendency to fall back on what you knew before, which was, I controlled everything. But the danger of the confidence thing is you start to worry about whether empowering others will somehow diminish your role or your value. And you feel like the only way to make sure that no one sees your value as diminished is to overcompensate with control and authority. And the other thing is, when you lack confidence, it's not too long before your team figures it out. And no one wants to be led by someone who is not confident in their own abilities. When you lack confidence in your leadership ability, when you lack confidence in your ability to perform your role, how are you going to be the one that fights for their promotions, fights for their compensation, pushes back when you need to push back? How are you going to be that one? Well, many times leaders don't push back. Many times leaders don't fight for the compensation. Many times leaders don't fight for the promotion. And many times that's because they lack confidence. But here's the one that bothers me. Fear of being outshone. For some, the thought of someone on their team doing a better job than they are is terrifying. It's like they're scared to let anyone else step up into the spotlight, because if someone performs too well, it might reveal areas that they are weak. So instead of empowering them or empowering their team, they hold them back. This mindset is toxic. It's a morale killer. It's a team killer. It's a leadership failure. When people see this happening, they feel they can't contribute. They can't grow. They have no voice. They cannot have respect for a leader like this. This one is the hardest for me to have any sympathy for. I'm just going to say this, and you can underline this. If you are leading people and you feel this way, you feel like you have a fear of being outshone, so much so that you don't allow anyone else to get the spotlight, you're holding people back, you need to take a good, hard look at yourself in the mirror and either acknowledge that a change in attitude and approach is required, or acknowledge that you are not fit to be in a leadership position. This is totally unacceptable. So whether it's fear of failure, fear of losing control, fear of being exposed, or worse, fear of letting someone else take the spotlight, you can imagine how tough leadership can be. It's not for the faint of heart. This is why you constantly hear me talking about real leadership being brave. It takes real courage to be a leader. But if you are in this position, you have to move past all these fears in order to lead effectively. You have to create the kind of following that is inspired, where people follow because they want to and not because they have to. No one wants to follow or be led by a coward. I don't want to just shine the light on the leader or the manager, but I also want to turn it around and shine the light on the person who feels like they're being micromanaged. Could there be accountability there as well? Let's say you are someone who feels as though you are being micromanaged. It's easy to label your boss or your manager or your leader as a control freak. Get frustrated, throw up your hands, and say, I'm out of here. I want you to look in the mirror. Sometimes there are very real reasons behind this behavior that are worth you taking a good, hard look at. Remember what I said earlier. Leadership comes with real accountability. And sometimes it's unfortunately ruthless accountability. And these people need to be successful for their families. They have families to feed just like you do. So let's break it down. I would like you to ask yourself some tough questions. Am I giving him or her a reason for concern? Am I executing? Am I reliable? And this isn't about pointing fingers. It's just about awareness and accountability so we can figure out how to move forward. If your performance is shaky, that is going to be a trigger for any leader to tighten the reins until they feel confident that you're back on track. Micromanagement is sometimes a response. It's not always a starting point. And I want you to remember that the past matters. Sometimes managers or leaders, they're not reacting just to the present moment. They're responding to a pattern that they've seen. If you had projects that go sideways, or if there's been communication breakdowns, your history sticks. If they don't have confidence in your ability to deliver those results, you can bet they will have to step in closer. So before you throw your micromanager label around, take a second look and reflect. Are you doing everything you can to build trust? If you're inconsistent, unclear, or not delivering, then yeah, you're going to feel that closer oversight until you've built back that trust. So let's talk about how we solve for micromanagement. Let's start from the employee perspective, or those of you that feel like you're being micromanaged. I think the first thing to do is what we just talked about. Have that self-reflection conversation with yourself. And if the answer comes back, you know what, I can be better. Well, then be better. Figure out how you can build that credibility back. Make sure you're doing everything you can to be seen as reliable. So if you're willing to self-reflect, well, then you have this conversation. And that is my next thing. Have open conversation and communication. And you want to know how wonderful it would be for a really good leader to hear. I just want to tell you, even though I've been feeling the pains of the micromanagement, I feel like you watch everything. I feel like you're on top of me. I did some self-reflecting, and I feel I understand why. I could be better. I could be more reliable. I could execute better. The product could be better. And I'm going to do everything I can from here on out to make sure I'm doing my part so that your confidence in me comes back. As a leader myself, if anyone had come into me with that kind of maturity, that kind of self-reflection, boy, would I be in their corner, making sure that I'm doing everything I can to help them with the areas they need growth in because they've taken the initiative to self-reflect. So step number 1, self-reflect. Step number 2, come up with a plan to course correct. Step number 3, have the open communication with your leader or your manager. Remember, your words have to be followed with action. So if you do all the great things, you self-reflect, you create a plan, you have a great conversation with your leader, and then you don't do anything, well, that's not going to go well. That's not going to go well. You're going to lose trust further. And so if you do all those things and the micromanagement doesn't stop, well, that gets followed by an open and honest conversation, which is, what have I not done? And you might hear, you've done everything. You've actually done everything. I cannot figure out how to stop micromanaging. It's just in me. And it could have anything to do with all those other things we talked about. And that's feedback you have to take. You have to figure out if that's an environment you can stay in, knowing the shortcomings of your leader, but knowing full well that you did everything you can to rectify the situation. There's such a great victory in that. I don't want to ignore the other potential outcome where you feel like you've done everything and then your boss says, "No, I still think there's more to do," because they are unwilling to acknowledge, as a mature leader should, that they have shortcomings, so they continue to put shortcomings on you. Well, then you receive what they say and you get to decide as a mature professional if you agree with it or not. You take the self-reflection exercise and you decide, do I agree with this or not? And if you don't agree with it, well, then you're back into that other camp, which is you understand your situation and you understand your leadership shortcomings and you understand that you need to make a decision as to what you're going to do going forward. But if they happen to uncover something that you do need to rectify, well, then you move forward accordingly. All right, let's switch to the leader's perspective, because I know there's a lot of folks out there who are in leadership positions and they struggle with those fears we talked about because it's tough. The first thing you have to do is own these insecurities and own these fears. You have to understand that leadership comes with fear. It does, but you cannot effectively lead unless you're willing to be brave. And part of that bravery comes from trusting your team. And if you don't trust your team, you need to figure out how to solve for that. Do you have to nurture the relationships? Do you have to demonstrate that you truly care to invest in them, that you truly care to have their back? Do you need to invest in their skill sets so that you feel better? So you got to own the fears. If the fears are you don't trust your team, I just talked about some of the things you can do. If the fears are confidence issues or imposter syndrome issues, what you have to do is you have to reflect on you have to constantly remind yourself of why you're in the position you're in. Remind yourself that it's okay to fail as long as you're doing the best you can every day. You want to know when failure hurts the most? It's when you knew you could have done better. When you knew you could have been in the office earlier, when you knew if you stayed just a little bit later, when you knew if you read that document one more time. When we know we've done everything we could, we gave our max effort, failure doesn't sting as much. It's a learning opportunity, but it hurts when you're like, I knew I should have been there earlier. I knew I should have read that one more time. I knew I should have done some more due diligence. I knew I should have had that conversation. That's when failure sucks. That's when failure stings. You cannot lead with fear of failure. You're going to have to focus on the 20% that's going to yield the 80% role. You're going to make mistakes. That's just part of it. And if you are a person who cannot see yourself as making mistakes, you need to own that. And you need to own that you cannot lead, because there is no leader that will make zero mistakes. And if you're constantly worried about making mistakes and you cannot get over it, then you cannot lead people. The good news is, you can get over it. Everyone makes mistakes. What makes you so special that you can't make mistakes, that you are perfect? You're not. So get over it. Acknowledge that you're going to make mistakes and move on. But don't make mistakes because you didn't put in the effort. Somebody once said to me, when it comes to decision making, if you make a decision and it turns out to be the wrong decision, that is unfortunate. But if you decide not to make a decision, that is unacceptable. And that stuck with me because, you can become paralyzed for fear of making a mistake. In a leadership position, you cannot be paralyzed. People need you to make decisions, sometimes very quickly. And what you do is you draw on all your experience, you draw on all your hard work, and you hope that all that experience and all that hard work that got you to the position that you are in is good enough to have you make the best decision possible. And if it turns out to be the wrong one, well, you did the best you could. That is okay. You have to worry first and foremost about your team. And if you worry first and foremost about your team, believe it or not, your team will take care of you. Your team, in all my experience, I started with care for my team, and you will be shocked and awed by how much they have your back. They'll come in and say, don't forget about this meeting. They'll come in and say, here's a document. I want you to be prepared for tomorrow. They'll come in and say, I heard this question come up. I want you to be prepared. They will have your back when they know you have their back. And the only way that happens is when they trust and believe you care about them. It takes, first and foremost, acknowledging that you have a problem. Acknowledging that you have to work inward to get the outward results. And so if you're micromanaging, I think this is totally solvable. And if you're being micromanaged, look inward, but this is also totally solvable. There's a story that I heard once. It was about a boss who had an assistant and they were working late one night, and the boss handed this document to his assistant and he asked him to review it overnight and make sure it was perfect. So the assistant took it home. He combed through it thoroughly. He made all sorts of corrections, and then he left the new, improved version on his boss's desk in the morning. When he returned, he saw a little note on it that read, "Are you sure this is good?" So the assistant felt a bit insecure and unsure. So he took it back. He reviewed it overnight again, and he made some more tweaks. Once again, in the morning, he placed it back on the boss's desk. And when he returned, he found another note, and it said, "Are you really sure this is good?" So he took it back, he combed through it. This happened a couple more times. Finally, the assistant, at his wit's end, approaches his boss and said, "Boss, I've reviewed this document so many times, I don't know what else I can do." And the boss smiled and said, "Good, now I'll read it." So I find this story funny and fascinating. Give people the space to take ownership and come to their own level of certainty and confidence. When you empower people to take responsibility and stand by their work, you build trust. And with trust, there's no need for micromanagement. I'll leave you with this quote from Teddy Roosevelt. "The best executive is the one who has sense enough to pick good people to do what he wants done, and self-restraint to keep from meddling with them while they're doing it." That's the mark of true leadership. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, keep fighting for better culture and better leadership. And let's make micromanagement totally unacceptable.